I am very proud, Hannah is right, to accept this position as Professor of Global and Transnational History, and I look very much forward to working with my special responsibilities for the further development of a strong research environment for global and transnational history here at the Department for Communication and Arts. Most of the work to that regard will be to continue with developing the research group for global and transnational history towards new joint research projects across the department, across Roskilde University, and in cooperation with our colleagues internationally. Our ambitious long-term aim is that global and transnational history will be something that people out there, maybe not right out there, but will identify with historical research at Roskilde University, hopefully in relation to all the other great globally oriented initiatives going on here, from the Critical Edge Alliance to Cultural and Post-Colonial Studies to the Global Humanities Bachelor's Program and many others. It would be great if we in a not too distant future were a global satellite here in these lovely surroundings. In the 1990s, somebody made up the term glocal. In other words, unprovincial in the province. That's what we want to be, I think. Utopian maybe, but in many ways in tune with my topic for today. First, I think it's in order to try to define what it is that we mean by global and transnational history. In a nutshell, global history is a perspective from above on the globe, while transnational history is horizontal, but let me elaborate for a bit. We have occasionally been met with slight confusion because in many connections, global and transnational history is considered to be two different things. One answer could also be that GT-HIST is a cool acronym, while G-HIST or T-HIST sounds like an energy drink. Well, global and transnational history have different traditions. Global history has a long history going back to the earliest Greek histories of the world, but it is common to identify its modern beginnings in the Enlightenment with the development of secular narratives of the evolution and progress of the history of the world, or the history of civilization, seen as a whole, seen as a single subject, which could be narrated following the traces of what was considered universally relevant. This is surely also the beginning of modern Eurocentrist perspectives of the world and world development, which today I think still works almost automatically, despite decades of strong criticism, and which makes it important to keep studying these foundations of modern conceptualizations of the world, of history, of progress, of the universal, and so on. At the heart of such an integrated or seen from above perspective is, to my mind, still fascinating questions of what qualifies to be in a global history. How does it qualify? What are the processes of identification and qualification of what is relevantly global, and thus also the qualification of its opposite, namely the insignificantly local or particular? Particularly when we're talking about the histories of cultures, civilizations, religions, ideas, the questions of qualification are most obvious. With historian Moshe Rossman, I call this contribution discourse. The social phenomenon in mention must include some singularity which has contributed to the whole in an identifiable way. In the 1990s, global history gained momentum for, I guess, obvious reasons. Historian Patrick O'Brien wrote in the introduction to the brand new Cambridge Journal of Global History in 1996, and I think that we can see it here, yes, and I quote, "To my mind, all scholarship must meet needs or react to questions and problems that actually," no, sorry, maybe it was correct actually, sorry. "To my mind, all scholarship must meet needs to react to questions and problems that actually exist in the world, not met in a narrow politicized sense, or in the these days very popular for the purposes of private sector economy sense, but for the purposes of life and living together on the planet, which often go against what is good for politicians and companies. A conveniently broad definition of relevance for us humanities and social science people, you could say. That's why I like O'Brien's statement of purpose. And here it is. The case for the restoration of global history rests on its potential to construct negotiable meta-narratives based upon serious scholarship that will become cosmopolitan in outlook and meet the needs of our globalizing world. It claims that we need new global histories. To illustrate the point further, in the same introduction, O'Brien also stated that for the past 2 centuries, all historiographical traditions converged either to celebrate or react to the rise of the West. I believe that this bold statement is mostly true. Either global histories are Eurocentric, or they are critical towards Eurocentric histories, which effectually converges Eurocentrism and postcolonialism. It is difficult to avoid this conundrum, but it looks less strange when compared with nationally oriented history, which for 120 years has dominated the history field. Either national history celebrates Denmark, or it criticizes Denmark. Methodological nationalism prevails in both cases. That is why the perspective needs to be cosmopolitan, as a way to overcome the convergence between Eurocentrism and reactions to Eurocentrism. But what that means I will return to later. Thus, in the definition proposed by the newest Journal of Global History, as we have seen with Patrick O'Brien, global history is a comparative and cumulative history. It looks at, for example, the development of interregional trade in Southeast Asia between 1850 and 1900, and compares this development with the Mediterranean region in the same period, to take one example from the journal. With a view from above, studies of comparisons and connections globally can accumulate to a more total image of global historical development. It is different with a much younger transnational historical perspective. It is not comparative, or it's not cumulative. In the words of historian Patricia Clavin, transnational history is histories that study border-crossing phenomena such as the movement of people, things, ideas across borders, which are most often very national. Transnational history recognizes the national as an important container, both pragmatically, as in the world is composed of nations or aspiring nations, think of the Kurds or the Palestinians, and as a matter of identity. Transnational migration is also done by people who would consider themselves belonging to nations no matter how transnationally they might live. In transnational history, there is no view from above. It most often follows in the footsteps of the actors, the things, or the ideas studied, excavating how one important site is connected to the next. This way, new interactive maps of the global are constructed, but in a horizontal perspective. The world is not global in the outset, but in the making. Just for a change. I find transnational history to be something quite different from the extremely widespread use of the concept of transnationalism in migration studies, as particularly represented by Nina Glick-Schiller, Steven Vertovec, and others, who have developed transnational studies of migration over the past 2 decades. In such perspectives, transnationalism is a descriptive term indicating, pointing to a new globalized sociology of cross-border mobility, while transnational history is occupied with diagram elements of, say, how international relief networks under World War I became an important starting point for global civil society movements, or how Zionism started out as a transnational network of people who redrew the boundaries of Jewish territory and eventually founded a nation-state. A wonderfully paradoxical case. Giving such examples, I draw on what I have learned over the past 4 years being part of a joint research project. In transnational history, there often is an element of asking genealogical questions related to the beginning and the subsequent spread of a phenomenon, an idea, a thing, a network, and so on. Well, now we for sure understand the mild confusion that we occasionally have been met with bringing global and transnational history together. My best answer is that I think it's very fruitful to bring these perspectives together, since they both deal with questions of how to think and write historically in a globalizing or global perspective. Not for history's own sake, of course, but for the purpose of understanding how our humanist and social faculties over time have organized descriptions and knowledge of the world, leading to perspectives we today use to sense-making of and in a global habitat. Cosmopolitanism unites global and transnational history, I think, and it opens up for interesting questions such as, how are things connected? How are they exchanged? How did this or that phenomenon grew from micro to macro scale? Without having sworn in my collaborators, I dare to say that we must be agnostics about whether global history or transnational history is the best way to address global challenges, and see them combined within O'Brien's cosmopolitan attitude. I will now turn to my own specific research on cosmopolitanism and its complicated historical relationship with Jewish history. I share interest with a number of other historians who are less interested in the normative celebration of cosmopolitanism than its effects on cultural, historical, and political ideas and initiatives vis-à-vis practical problems related to social boundaries or boundaries of civility and solidarity. It means that we are not that interested in questions such as what did Spinoza, Mendelssohn, Dohm, or Kant really mean? We're interested in how their great ideas were used, interpreted, and put into practice. In other words, we are not policing the border between proper or improper uses of the past. What does cosmopolitanism mean when looked upon from the side of its effects, as something with practical implications? And why does cosmopolitanism not only include a new horizon of expectation, but also a reorganization of our Erfahrungsraum, of our reservoir of experiences? The quick answer is that it's not possible to separate the future from the past. For the ones of you familiar with the work of one of my heroes, Reinhard Koselleck, this is not a surprise. But let me also quote George Herbert Mead from his philosophy of the present to the same point. And I quote, "Open futures are conditioned on multiple pasts," end of quote, meaning the past must include multiple possibilities of encoding for new futures to come within expectation. So before you accuse me of raving relativism, let me make my case further. As remarked by sociologist Robert Fine in his excellent book on modern cosmopolitanism, it seems like the cosmopolitan vision is more about the future than it is about the past. The past appears less important to cosmopolitan thought than it appears to nationalist thought, for example. Nationalists like to talk a lot about the past, and cosmopolitans about the present and the future. But since the Enlightenment and the beginning of modern cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitans have nevertheless been intensely occupied with history. When interpreting Immanuel Kant's two seminal texts on cosmopolitanism, which are Idee zu einer allgemeinen Geschichte in weltbürgerlicher Absicht from 1784 and Zum ewigen Frieden from 1795, emphasis is often on how he envisioned that the global polis should be managed by international regulation, an international council, and anchored in a principle of hospitality, and much less on what idea of history his visions rested on. These features of cosmopolitanism are what occupies Ulrich Beck and Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, Sailor Ben Habib, Robert Fine, and most authors within what has been termed the new cosmopolitanism. In this literature, Kant is the starting point. Included in this cosmopolitanism, which I will refer to as Kantian from now on, is a vision of universal progress. A universal progressive historical teleology inspired directly by the mentioned text by Kant. This means that Kantian cosmopolitanism is dependent on seeing the world as a unified time-space, where it is possible to historically follow the evolution of the human spirit, the spirit of universal civility. If we, with the Kantians, look at cosmopolitanism as the gradual progressive evolution of reason towards a universal global common sense manifested in a priori givens such as natural law, natural religion, and hospitality, then history's purpose is to rid us of historical burdens that are not compatible with universal civility, historical burdens which are not compatible with cosmopolitan principles. Kantian cosmopolitanism knows the end goal of human history in a way that reminds me of Fukuyama's liberal thesis about the end of history. It knows the critical tools, and it knows the distinctions between the civilized and the non-civilized, those on the right path and those on the wrong. Kantian cosmopolitanism is accordingly very idealist. It is an ideology. To the Kantian tendency in the literature, cosmopolitanism is a duty because it corresponds with a kind of natural history that follows in the footsteps of enlightenment. Nature's purpose for man is to develop over the generations towards more advanced stages of civilization. This purpose cannot be found in individual man, but in the species as a whole. If universal history is to be discernible and indeed possible at all, it must be organized along a certain set of propositions. And here we come close to the core of what I before called contribution discourse. Among these propositions is that every creature's natural predisposition are destined to develop fully in accordance with their purpose. And let me quote Kant here. I quote, "An organ that is not meant to be used or an arrangement that does not achieve its purpose is a contradiction to the teleological theory of nature." End of quote. If we do not accept this principle, we cannot understand history, says Kant. And I think much cosmopolitanism implicitly follows this teleology. When writing about Judaism specifically, Kant was convinced that Judaism could not be classified as a natural religion. He did not believe that Judaism was such a useful organ in the world body. Judaism was a contradiction with the teleological theory of nature. In Kant's own view, Judaism was amoral and accordingly did not carry with it the potential of cosmopolitan duty. The amorality of Judaism derives from it being a polity more than a true religion. The Jews follow their God as a despot, as a set of statutory laws that leave no room for morality and freedom. Thus, this definition of law religion is still with us, but today it is mainly used as a tool against Muslims in public debate. Kant, Lessing, Dohm, and other prominent enlighteners advocated equal civil rights for Jews across Europe. But what historian Miriam Leonard calls, and I quote, their Christian triumphalism remained a problem for Jewish enlighteners and reformers such as Moses Mendelssohn, and later for other Jewish cosmopolitans such as Moses Hess and Horace M. Callan. In a nutshell, the problem was that Jews and Jewishness was irrelevant for this historical and future vision. Individual Jews would have a place equal to other citizens, but the qualities of Judaism and Jewishness were considered particular and historical, and thus a fundamental pollution of the envisioned civility. The history of the civil spirit went from Athens to Rome, from Rome to Christianity, and from Christianity to universality, leaving Judaism as a relic of history and Jews as living fossils. The controversy for the Jewish enlighteners was not about laws, rights, and the international management of hospitality, which indeed were very liberating ideas, but about the scheme of historical progression that scandalized Jewishness in the civil sphere. But there are also other perspectives in the literature on cosmopolitanism that are what I have just referred to as Kantian. This perspective is more pragmatic, and it is interested in examples of cosmopolitanism wherever they might be found. Not surprisingly, Jewish history comes up as rich with cosmopolitan practices. Jewishness lends itself easily to cosmopolitan perspectives if we accept historian Yuri Schleskin's and others' Judaism equals nomadism line of thought. Jews are displaced, homeless, diasporic, at home in the world, real Europeans, true global citizens, ethnic minorities, expatriates, in exile, just to name the most used headlines of what signal both Jewishness and the cosmopolitan condition. A world in which most people live with mobility, difference, border-crossing risks, border-crossing ethnoscapes and mediascapes, global products and global fashions. In this way, Schleskin can make the cosmopolitan condition Jewish, in a way that is not much different from what prominent cultural studies scholars such as Carol Breckenridge and Homi Bhabha would call minoritarian modernity. The cosmopolitan condition exists in this sociologically oriented perspective when the nation-state, the polity within borders in which we live, cannot secure our rights, prosperity and security without engaging in wars on the other side of the globe and without engaging in global environmental policies or the global market economy. Under such conditions, cosmopolitanism is needed to make sense of all these mutually dependent associations, and not the least to secure the rights of individuals. In such perspectives, cosmopolitanism cannot be defined as squarely as in the Kantian tradition. Cosmopolitanism is, in the pragmatic perspective, both structure and agency, something which can be studied and should be studied with a much more empirically sensitive attitude than through idealist notions of what cosmopolitanism a priori means. Breckenridge, Bhabha, and their associates go as far as rejecting definitions. And finally, I got to press this again. Here we have it. Woo! And I quote, Cosmopolitanism may instead be a project whose conceptual content and pragmatic character are not only as yet unspecified, but also must always escape positive and definitive specification. Precisely because specifying cosmopolitanism positively and definitively is an uncosmopolitan thing to do. Very well said. Instead, we should search for cosmopolitan archives globally and historically to learn about the practice of cosmopolitanism as it has been and as it is. Studying global cosmopolitan archives includes what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called the provincialization of European ideas. In this perspective, as they suggest, the Jews or Jewishness has a model value to the world, just as other transnational minorities, it seems. Just as it has already been suggested by Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin, who in 1993 claimed that the Jewish contribution to the world is diaspora, understood as the ability to maintain community and identity across time, territory, without sovereignty and without the suppressing of other peoples, which would make Zionism the real scandal in Jewish history. In the Boyarin's perspective, the cosmopolitan world could learn from diasporic Jews that it is indeed possible to live in a group in the world without a territory and without political sovereignty. Studying Jewish histories and cultures would then be lessons in and for the changing of the present and for the prospects of the future. It would be significant cosmopolitan archives to study. The Jews and Jewishness is then, in a pragmatic perspective, histories to study for learning about cosmopolitanism, while for philosophically oriented cosmopolitanism, the perspective of the latter are a minority who would benefit from being protected by hospitality law and rights, while in the former perspective, the Jews and Jewishness are a combination of a model and a prophecy to fit present and future conditions. They are the cosmopolitans. For these reasons, many Jewish intellectuals have been skeptical about the concept of cosmopolitanism. Many have, in concordance with recent post-colonial perspectives, seen the Jews and other minorities as cosmopolitan victims of cosmopolitanism. In the following, I'll give a few examples to show how this problem of civility and uncivility in cosmopolitanism has manifested itself in sources related to Jewish history, or more specifically to the Jewish struggle for equal rights and inclusion since the Enlightenment. With the late Enlightenment's debates over the rights of man, rationality, civil improvement, historical progression, and the purpose of religion, came also intense debates over what to do with Europe's largest minority, the Jews. All prominent enlighteners supported equality to the Jews and the inclusion into civil society. And that is one of the reasons why we today celebrate their writings, speeches, and reformist efforts. What is more interesting for my purposes, though, are the conditions that these heroes of enlightenment set up for the possibility of inclusion of the Jews. I have already mentioned Immanuel Kant at some length, but enlighteners across the line all believed that the Jews had to be improved in a double meaning. I just brought this picture in because I really like it. It's Lessing and Mendelssohn debating issues of rationality and enlightenment while Lavater is watching. Nobody knows who the woman is. What we see here is Christian Wilhelm von Dom's famous argument for the civil improvement of the Jews, 1781, über die bürgerliche Verbesserung der Juden. What is so interesting about this reform paper is, apart from the fact that it advocated equal rights for the Jews, is that it explained how the Jews needed improvement. For society to be improved, the Jews had to be rather harshly re-educated into universalized society, unlearning their cheating, uncivil, untrustworthy ways, which in Dom's paper comes across as a very normal empirical experience. When you read this document, you think that everybody knew that the Jews were bad for society's internal solidarity. In Dom and virtually all other Christian enlighteners' way of thinking about the universally good, we see this double meaning of improvement. The Jews were a bad influence on society's perfection, but it was part of society's perfection to improve the Jews. This is what Willy Goetzel in a recent good book has called the Scandal of Jewishness. To bear the particular mark of Jewishness in the public sphere scandalizes your public appearance. It puts a stain on your civility. There are different varieties of causes and effects. Some believed that the Jews were in a very sorry moral state because they have been excluded and that their character was a reflection of their social position, such as the Abbé Grégoire in France under the Revolution. While others believe that there's something corrupt and dangerous in the historical and religious nature of the Jews, such as Vendôme in Germany, as we can see in this document. Both sides agree, though, that equality and inclusion will cure the ills of Jewish character. It is a matter of social education, of education into the decorum of civility as a universalized solidarity with a universalized community. No matter which way you turn causes and effects, the remedy is the same: Verbesserung, improvement. In the Danish context, there is no clearer example of this than the so-called Letter of Freedom issued by King Frederik VI in 1814 to the Danish Jews. In return for the right to do commerce on equal footing with other Danes, the Jews lost autonomy over their religious services, their education, and even their rabbis had to be approved by the state. I even think I have a picture of it. That is the so-called Letter of Freedom. This led to a split in the Danish Jewish community, where a lot of members had a huge problem with this state intervention. But it also made the Jews Danish. It reminds me of Moses Hess, who wrote in the 1860s, and I quote, "Every time I hear the word cosmopolitanism, I think of a pure German soul." End of quote. Why is this about cosmopolitanism when I talk about Denmark? Because the problem is the same. The questions are the same as the ones I asked in the beginning. How do groups qualify to be part of the universalized civility? And how do they remove the stain made by their particularity? This problem repeats itself in virtually all the sources I have studied related to Jewish equality and integration, from legal documents to letters and diaries to novels to philosophical treatises. Not only across different logics of causes and effects, but also across the majority-minority divide. Jewish reformers simply agreed that the Jews had a problem with what Hegel called Sittlichkeit, meaning the behavioral and moral code behind social rules and regulations. Jewish reformers supported integration efforts that forced Jews out of their own schools. Mendelssohn supported Vendôme. Jewish reformers and social movements supported radical reforms of synagogue practices, language, dress, and bodily posture. They initiated thousands of such initiatives of improvement, civilization, and indeed cosmopolitanization. Let me give you a short satirical anecdote of these efforts from German author Oskar Panizza, who in 1893 wrote a short essay entitled Die operierte Jud. I think I have a picture of Panizza here. He followed a very fashionable fantastical tradition of ending his life in a mental institution. Panizza's story is about Itzig Feidelstern. This is the cover of the collection. Look how colored it is. It's great, it's fantastic. Well, the story is about Itzig Feidelstern, who very much desires to be German. He works hard to blend into German society, but his alien Yiddish persona keeps betraying him as a Jew, and accordingly not as a real German. The story's narrator is Feidel's German friend who wants to help Feidel blend into German society. The narrator describes the monstrosity of Feidel, and I quote, "It would take a linguist, a choreographer, an aesthete, an anatomist, a tailor, and a psychiatrist, all in one to grasp and fully explain Feidel's entire appearance, what he said, how he walked, and what he did." End of quote. Feidel seeks both acceptance and recognition, which surprises the narrator despite his not very flattering descriptions of Feidel. And I quote again, I observed with astonishment how this monster took terrible pains to adapt to our circumstances, our gesticulations, the expression of our spiritual movements, our manner of speech." End of quote. In the recognition of the fact that Feidel's efforts are not effective enough, the narrator takes Feidel to meet the leading anatomist, Professor Klotz. Feidel is, of course, very wealthy. And he pays the professor to operate on him, to do surgery on him, until he looks German. Feidel goes through the most painful and obscure operations to the effect that he, after intensive training and recuperation, can blend unnoticed into German society. But the question remained, and I quote, "Did Feidel have a soul?" This question was debated everywhere for months by all those people, educators and doctors, who had something to do with him. End of quote. The ultimate test to find the answer to the genuineness of Feidel's transformation was that of marriage. If Feidel could find a pure German girl and convince her of his German character, then transformation must be considered completed. Feidel's transformation was, and I quote, "a complete psychophysical operation." End of quote. Panizza hits the nail on the head, I think. Jewish efforts of self-improvement came across as willed, strategic, and superficial. The anti-Semites knew it, and many Jews or ex-Jews knew it. Karl Marx knew in Zur Judenfrage in 1844 that the Jews were a social class who had more or less the same function for society as capital or savings, this liquid in between producers and the owners, which disconnect production value from the symbolic value. And thus, in a future and better society, Marx wrote, we won't need Jews anymore, which would be good for society at large, but also good for the Jews, because then they wouldn't have to be Jews. Heinrich Heine also knew it. To become the cosmopolitan that he was, he needed to be not Jewish, so he became a Christian. Richard Wagner and his circle also knew that the Jews were superficial. They replaced art with skill, he wrote. And Otto Weininger, history's probably most tragic Jewish guy, and author of the notorious Geschlecht und Charakter, he really knew it. He killed himself in Beethoven's own house in 1903, as if to say to Wagner, you're right, we Jews can never live up to that. A view over more than a century's different sources related to Jewish equality and inclusion reflects that the core issue is the conundrum of how to remove the Jewish stain from the public sphere, in the public sphere, without replacing it with another stain which becomes even more Jewish. Universalized cosmopolitan civility is a struggle for the values in the civil sphere, both micro-scale and macro-scale. And by values, I mean historical, cultural, and religious values. In civil spheres, the particular origins of values are purified over time. They are deprimordialized and extended into values which are universally good for all people. Who sees this process better than a minority such as the Jews? The Zionists were the first social movement of Jews who recognized fully that the Jewish stain was not to be removed by formalities and niceties. Theodor Herzl's journey to Zionism is probably the classic case. Max Nordau's books, speeches, and plays, along with many other Zionists' experiences, show us that Zionism was about normalization, about bringing the Jews out of what Nordau called the new ghetto. All these early Zionists were proud cosmopolitans, which makes the point about the struggle for the values of the civil sphere stand out even more clearly. Zionism's visionary land was thought to be a mirror of cosmopolitanism, rationality, science, and progressive modernity in general. What the cleverest of the Jewish reformers and Zionists understood was that equality in the civil sphere is not only about ideals and about the future in a wishful sense. It is about the histories, about which histories are appropriated, which histories are identified as contributing to the common good and which are not. It is within the faculties of the humanities and the social sciences that the argumentation for contribution, relevance, legitimacy, and thus precision are to be found. Let me quote one of my favorites, Emanuel Wolff, who in the Journal for Wissenschaft des Judentums in 1822 wrote, and I quote, "Science will decide upon the merits and demerits of the Jews, their fitness or unfitness to be given the same status and respect as other citizens." End of quote. Why could he think like that? Because science is about universality. The cleverest reformers knew that the Jews must require a new and better past if they wanted a new and better future. Wolff and his associates in the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement believed that the universalized cosmopolitan language of science would prove Jewish fitness, because the Jewish contribution to the history of civilization was so great. I'll just mention a few of their wonderful contributions. For example, God, law, justice, very important things. I can't help citing the Israeli Declaration of Independence from 1948 just for the fun of it. Here the Jews gave the Bible to the world. Such discussions were in the 1800s discussions about the values of the civil sphere. One of the most heated debates was from the 1830s about the Jewishness of Jesus, which Jewish reformers such as Abraham Geiger participated provocatively in with claims based on philological scholarship that Jesus was just another Pharisee, a Jewish teacher, and teaching such as Jesus's was in his own time very common. I will give one final example of how Jewish reformers struggled to revise the Jewish past to make the Jewish future look more promising. Many Jews who migrated to America between 1880 and World War I really looked to America as the promised land. A country where everyone came from somewhere else and where the future was everyone's. This promise was taken very seriously by a young migrant, Horace M. Callan, who came with his family in 1887. Callan spent his entire life as an academic and as a social activist fighting for free access to higher education. He was part of the establishment of the New School of Social Research in New York in 1919. He fought for consumer rights, for the rights of minorities, against the melting pot philosophy, which he thought of as very undemocratic, and for Zionism. One of his trademark quotes would be, and I quote, "In the symphony of civilization, the playing is the writing," end of quote, meaning we must improvise. Still, Callan was unable to free his mind from what I earlier called contribution discourse. He could not think of himself as a cosmopolitan because of its tainted history vis-à-vis the Jews, but he could criticize cosmopolitanism from a cosmopolitan point of view. He wrote a huge amount of newspaper columns, essays, books, held speeches, wrote letters, and he even wrote a play with a, to my mind, very telling title. It's called The Book of Job as a Greek Tragedy. Looking at this book, I'm reminded of Reinhard Koselleck's famous analysis of the Renaissance painting Die Alexanderschlacht by Altdorfer from 1528. Not because of any direct comparison, of course, but because Koselleck showed how such a painting contained multiple temporalities. It expressed a past present, a past past, and a past future. The same is the case with Callan's play. We have the classic competition between the Greeks and the Jews over who actually invented civilization. We have a strong effort for universalizing Jewish history, and we have a universal moral lesson for the future. Not surprisingly, Callan's Job was a pragmatist. Callan's doctoral supervisor was William James, so everything he looked at turned pragmatist. As the pragmatist that he was, Job experimented his way forward, despite being totally confused about God's plans. And he did not quit despite hardships and loss of direction. Job teaches us what was also Callan's personal motto: we need to struggle to keep struggling. Summing up, Callan's Job is 6 things. It is a universal moral tale. It is universal learning. It concludes with a morality that everyone can use, struggle to keep struggling. 2, it is a tragedy, and this needs some explanation. It was very important for Horace Callan to explain why Job was a tragedy, because in anti-Semitism and in anti-Semitic logics, one of the problems with the Jews was that they do not know tragedy. And they don't know when Jews don't know tragedy, that means that they can't die for a higher cause. They only struggle for the purpose of survival in itself. So that's why they would be disloyal to the nation or to higher values, even to art in the Wagner or Beethoven sense. Jews do not know tragedy. Of course, Callan wanted to show that the book of Job was indeed a Greek tragedy, just as Greek as the Greeks themselves. The third thing that it is also world literature. It should be placed in the library of world literature in the same way as the tragedies and comedies and all sorts of other wonderfully globally read pieces of literature. 4, it is also a student play. At this time, and probably still at American universities, students would set up classical plays as part of their spare time, but also part of their education. And in the university where Callan taught at this time, in the University of Michigan, it was very popular to set up classical Greek comedies and tragedies. And Callan worked extremely hard as an assistant professor to become allowed to set up the book of Job as a Greek tragedy. And finally he actually succeeded. And that's why that he wanted to publish it as a book. I can tell you that the introduction, of course, he had to have it made by a recognized professor of theology to say that this reading, even though it was written by a Jew, was probably okay. 5, and very interestingly, I think, he also wanted to present Job as secularist literature. This refers to a struggle within the history of ideas over which sources have inspired modern secularism. And Jewish intellectuals were very eager to show that the Jewish tradition included the history of secularism, that there was a Jewish tradition for secularism that ran all the way back to the books in the Bible, the book of Job being the most important one. So that it was actually not from Christianity and the Enlightenment that secularism came, it was from Jewish tradition. 6, Job is also a very straightforward pragmatist essay, which could be one of the essays in one of William James's collections. So in that way, I think that it can be read as in an Alexander Schlacht kind of way, as an instance of multiple temporalities that show which kind of historical and cultural and religious struggles happens in a given present. Conclusion. In conclusion, I hope that I have outlined some aspects of the complicated relationship between the Jewish history of exclusion and inclusion and cosmopolitanism. And I also hope that I've illustrated to you how developing future-oriented philosophies, politics, and practices, such as cosmopolitanism, not only is about having good ideas for what is to come, it equally includes new encodings of the past. Jewish history is a rich archive of historical struggles over what is universally relevant and what is particular, over how to identify what contributions to our common history means and how they are placed in a hierarchy. And the Jewish History Archive is full of examples of which social consequences such historical struggles can have. Thank you.